just a little introduction. I felt like Michael Fassbender really needed to be in this. But, okay, so I'm going to be talking about marriage, mission, and mimicry in Jane Eyre. And so before I kind of really get started in what I'm talking about, I just kind of wanted to take you a little bit through my process. So when I was first looking at Jane Eyre and deciding to do something talking about the ending, I did a lot of research, a lot of research. And I kind of found two really big main arguments that were happening. And the first of those was considering that Jane decides to marry Rochester and to kind of commend St. John for what he's doing. They argue that because she is strong in her faith and her decisions, that she actually makes these decisions with full faith and knowledge, and she is able to continue on in her path to self-agency and self-empowerment. And the first of these critics that I kind of really came across that were saying these was Emily Greisinger, and she comes up with this idea of biblical feminism. With her idea of biblical feminism, she kind of states that because Jane is empowered by her faith, she is able to make decisions. And then Maria Lemanaka kind of comes after her and says, by discerning for herself what she perceives to be God's will, Jane effectively resists Rochester and St. John's attempts to possess her spirit as well as her body. So what they're doing here is kind of really focusing on the fact that before she decides to go back to Rochester and commend St. John for his work, what they're really doing is focusing that she first denied them, that she first decided what was right for her, and then proceeded to go back to them, which I think was really interesting, but some of what I found missing in this analysis was talking about the colonial project. If you're talking about her commending St. John for his work, you have to talk about the fact that the final pages are talking about missionary and commending missionary. So Pamela Roy comes in, and she's the other side of the argument, who says that because she does marry Rochester and because she's promoting missionary work, she's actually subverting back into the roles that she tries so hard to break from. And she says, emblematizing most aptly her clandestine submission to the dictates of the institution she has sought to reevaluate and dislocate. And I thought this was really important. She's clearly straying from what we think that Jane is clearly straying from what we think she should be doing when she decides to marry Rochester, after she's already decided that she didn't want to because he was married. And then most importantly, the fact that the final passage in the entire novel ends with not Jane's words, but St. John's words through her. It's really hard to figure out what that means and what that importance is to Jane, and how that actually plays into her entire characterization. But the thing that I feel like Pamela Roy and this kind of discussion were missing was that while the end is ideologically loaded, there's two things kind of missing from this analysis. The first is that she is not specific in the kind of oppression that Jane is either backing into or whatever. In this case, she's arguing that she's going back into this kind of oppression. And on top of that, they're not relating it to her faith, which is really, really important in the novel. And so I'm going to attempt to unpack the final decision and show how Bronte creates in Jane Eyre a piece of literature that seemingly fits into the colonial discourse, but in actuality challenges it. So first, when we talk about Jane Eyre, a lot of her Christian beliefs really show early in the novel. She is constantly talking about God, and how she is supposed to perform is always in relation to how God is supposed to see children and women in particular. So when Brocklehurst comes to talk to her, he asks her, does she know what hell is? Does she know where bad children go? And she is able to tell him exactly what hell is and where they go. She knows what she's doing. She knows how the Christian faith, at least for her, has been taught and educated. But even though these things are shown, it's really not Jane's actual form of Christianity. It's what she's been taught. It's what she knows. It's what she can reiterate back to people. But a true moment, for me at least in the novel, when she really shows her faith in a deep way, is when she returns to Mrs. Reed on her deathbed. And Mrs. Reed has emotionally abused and mistreated Jane most of her life. And instead of asking Mrs. Reed what she has done to her, why she has done it to her, she tells her this: "Love me then or hate me as you will, you have my free and full forgiveness." So with this act, Jane has decided to take on extreme forgiveness. She is going to take away any and all pain that she can by giving her this forgiveness, which I think is really interesting, and this got me thinking in a whole new way. And so I was really searching for other moments that showed and revealed her true faith and how deep that level of faith was. And the next kind of instance that I saw was in her refusal of Mr. Rochester at the altar. She decides not to go through with the marriage once she finds out Mr. Rochester is actually married to Bertha, the crazy lady in the attic. And with this act, she decides to give up earthly love for divine love. She decides that that is the true love and the true search that she is going through in life. So she definitely decides that that is her right path because God is calling her to that path. And so with these two acts, along with a few others in the novel, for me, Jane kind of really reaches a new level of Christianity, almost to the point where she kind of takes this Christ-like association. But that's not enough to talk about Christ-like association. So the point that really solidifies this for me is part of the text. And it's when she finally decides to return to Rochester, once he is no longer married because Bertha dies, and once she has kind of experienced life on her own for a little bit. Once they're married, this happens. Mr. Rochester continued blind for the first 2 years. I was then his vision. He saw nature, he saw books through me. One morning at the end of 2 years, he eventually recovered the sight of that one eye. So with this, there's two things happening. The first is that Jane is clearly taking on the role of intermediary between God and Rochester. She is his spiritual connection, but she is more than just that. I don't know if you guys have ever heard the hymn, "Be Thou My Vision." We just sang it for choir on Tuesday. But she's literally doing that. She is his vision. She is doing those things for him. But on top of that, she healed him. I don't know if you noticed. But the last one, he eventually recovered the sight of that one eye. So she slowly, albeit, and limitedly so, only healed him of one eye, but at the end of it, he's able to see his child. And so she kind of really solidifies that kind of Christ-like association. She's that intermediary, she's able to heal, she's able to be that spiritual connection. So we should probably go back to this and talk about why it's limited, though. Clearly, he doesn't have perfect vision at the end of it. It takes 2 years for him to get the one eye. What's happening here? I think what's really most important about this kind of moment is the symbolic meaning and how that plays into the colonial discourse that the novel seems to be accommodating at the end. What she's doing here with Rochester is performing a sort of missionary work. She is healing him, she is making him new again, she is giving him spiritual guidance, and she is also giving him a new life to assert himself again as a man, a white man in England, and doing those things, which I think is super important. So now that we've kind of a little bit dealt with her decision to go marry Rochester, what do we do with the ending? What do we do with St. John? So this is where the connection between the two really works. So if she's doing missionary work with Rochester by marrying him and healing him and being his spiritual connection, then that's how she aligns with St. John. So Jane's rejection of becoming St. John's missionary wife reflects a consciousness that a truer calling may lie in England. So with this, she decides to say no to her role as missionary wife to St. John because she herself acts as a missionary in a much more active and hands-on way with Rochester. So that's why she refuses him. But what happens at the end, and she decides to commend him for his work and how that kind of plays out. And so we get to the final tribute, strengthens the case for Jane's spiritual maturity as well as for in contemplating a heroic end for St. John, she realizes she is like him. So with the similarity, the interesting part of this is if they're both doing missionary work and they both have this similarity, it makes sense as to why Jane would understand what St. John is doing and commend him for what he is doing. But at the same time, it's pretty interesting that they can be doing the same thing, and yet Jane is a woman. And like, there's a passage in the book where it talks about she is like poor, weak, obscure, and little. Those kinds of little things, and yet she's doing what St. John's doing. She's powerful. She's taking on the same kind of roles, which is super, super, super interesting to me. And then we get to this, which is, again, Pomeroy and the people who argue that she does not actually break free from the structure that she's a part of. And she says, the sanitation and the glorification of the missionary seems to be one more instance Bronte's uneasy accommodation with the Victorian religious superego. Okay, so with this, I was thinking, I was like, how does that work then? Because clearly she's a missionary and she's doing this work, and how do I save Jane then? How is she okay with doing all of these things and she's still the awesome person I want her to be? This, I think, for me, comes down to the fact that she is a woman doing these things. At the time, 19th century, that's unheard of. That's a big deal. And so she is promoting colonialism, but I kind of was searching for how that fit into everything. And so when I picked up Homi K. Bhabha's idea of the English book, that kind of really solidified and started to shape the ending for me in a new way. So if we're going to talk about the English book, I'm going to first kind of explain where that term comes from and how I'm going to use it. So the term actually comes from Bhabha borrowing the idea of mimicry from Jacques Lacan. And Lacan talks about mimicry, and he says, the effects of mimicry is camouflage. In the strictly technical sense, it is not a question of harmonizing with the background, but against a molded background of being modals, exactly like the technique of camouflage practiced in human warfare. So I kind of sat on this for a little while and was like, okay, what does that mean? How am I taking that in? And so for me, mimicry kind of became really interesting. So it's something that seems to be something that appears to look like what it's trying to do. And so with Bhabha, he takes this idea from Lacan, and he uses the example of Heart of Darkness for himself, and how he creates the term English book from mimicry. And Heart of Darkness, he shows two big examples from it. He shows how Heart of Darkness upholds the idea of colonization. He talks about how Marlowe consistently paints the African people in a bad light. He talks about how he uses animalistic terms for them and things like that. But on the other side of that, he uses Heart of Darkness, as many, Meadows not in here, but as many would say, to show that colonization is bad and that it's a terrible thing. He comments on Kurtz being like way too into what he's doing and not treating anybody like a human being and being too into possessions and things like that, which is super interesting. And I was like, how does that work with Jane Eyre? I think that I find something there. So Bhabha here says, through an act of repetition, the colonial text emerges uncertainly. Consequently, the colonial presence is always ambivalent, split between its appearance as an original authoritative and its articulation as a repetition and difference. So with Jane Eyre using this, Jane Eyre has the appearance of original colonial text. The very end of her novel is literally saying, missionary work is awesome, go St. John. And like, this is really interesting because yeah, that's a thing, that's happening. So anybody who's reading this novel, especially in the 19th century, can be like, woohoo, 19th century ideals being held up, go Bronte. But the point is it just has to appear to look that way. And the fact that Jane is deciding to do this is the moment which that appearance is made kind of thinner, or for lack of a better word. But that she actually is repeating with a difference. By Jane being the missionary and being the one that is actively participating in colonization, she's choosing to change that kind of structure in a different way. For me, a work to be considered in the grouping of the English book has to symbolize colonial rule, but in the process of doing so, falls susceptible to mimetic subversion. So that is what Jane is doing. She's showing that she can do these things and be this kind of like missionary on the front lines with Rochester. She's doing all of these things, which is super interesting. And it's the duality of mimicry, that double vision, which in choosing the ambivalence of colonial discourse also disrupts its authority. But how is she disrupting authority? That's kind of the more key thing here. So Jane's awesome, she's being a missionary, these cool things, but missionary work in general kind of isn't great. It's not awesome, we kind of all know that, but how how does Jane show that? And I think the most important part here is that Jane, by choosing to go with Mary Rochester and be cool with St. John, kind of shows that Jane can completely and totally transform the colonial structure. And if she can completely modify that for her own gain and for her own usage, then who's to say that, how solid is that structure then? That's what I really started thinking about. If Jane, one woman, small, meek, little, obscure, those things, can be a person who completely revolutionizes the way that colonization works, then couldn't that also mean that colonization in general is a pretty shaky establishment? And so Jane Eyre is a novel that follows the pattern of mimicry so closely that it becomes both an apparent representation of the advancement of the colonial project, as well as a piece of literature that disrupts and comments on the very notion of colonial discourse. So I think the importance of viewing Jane as a person who decides for herself to marry St. John and decides for herself to be a missionary and decides all of these things while under the appearance of seeming normal and furthering that kind of colonial discourse is really important, because it allows some people to read this novel and not see anything there. It is completely camouflaged, as Lacan says. But at the same time, it allows for anybody to read it and to read more into it and to see something there that shows them the shakiness of the colonial project, which I think is really important and something that kind of leads into the kind of anti-colonial discourse that comes later on. Which is why I was really, really interested to look at the ending, because it is so interesting. But the very last thing that is actually Jane's words, because she ends with St. John's words, but the very last words that are her own, she says, "Drew from my eye human tears and yet filled my heart with divine joy." By the end of the novel, Jane is happy where she is. She has married the man that she loves. She is performing acts for God. She is being a missionary and fulfilled in a new active way that she couldn't have been before. And so I think that Bronte here is smart, and she chooses something that works for her character. Jane, while technically is upholding the patriarchal structure that she tries to break free from, I would argue that she does indeed do that. And while she does it in a very undercover kind of way, that really is more important to do it so subtly that that way people can read into it in a specific way. And if you read into it, you are able to kind of see the unraveling of the entire structure that she starts. It's important that she doesn't do it all herself. And yeah, that's kind of what I got from this. Hopefully that's fine.